Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Futoryan, and this is the 25th Hour. This week we have a full slate of news coming to you. We'll be talking about the Blasio and his struggle to define the school reopenings, Cuomo and him being dogged by his nursing home policies, Trump and the RNC, the Jacob Blake shooting, and so much more. Stick with us in order to get the news from August 23rd to August 29th.
Let's stop the cocktail party madness.
Let's start with Mayor de Blasio. That recording was from a soundbite from the Brian Lehrer show. So for those of you who are interested in getting to know New York City politics a little bit more, there's a journalist, his name is Brian Lehrer from WNYC. He has these recordings with the mayor every now and then. I don't know how often it is. I don't remember off the top of my head. But there are unique opportunities to call into his show and ask the mayor questions. And so you usually get very nice snippets of the mayor getting pissed off at New Yorkers. Not all the time, but sometimes we get gems like that. Now, blaming it on avoiding overtime, the police have made civilians with little training or safety equipment tow away vehicles from crime scenes and accidents. As we talked about on the last show, the city and the state are facing a budget crisis due to the coronavirus pandemic. What does that mean? You pay taxes. Those taxes, I know that it feels like they don't go anywhere, but the taxes are used for various city programs, goes into the budgets of city agencies in order for them to carry out certain duties, and because people aren't going to work, because people aren't buying things, the economy is at a free fall, taxes are not being collected at the rate that they used to be at the start of the pandemic. And especially coinciding with the George Floyd protests, you had a movement to reduce the budget of police departments all over the country, and that includes the New York Police Department. So the New York is blaming those budget cuts and also their mandate to avoid overtime due to the last New York City budget that was passed. They are using civilians in order to tow away vehicles. Usually the police that have training would do that normally, and they would have the equipment to do it, but they're relying on civilians with little training or safety equipment to tow away those vehicles. Public Advocate Jumaane Williams demanded that the NYPD provide numbers associated with the arrest slowdown, but Commissioner Dermot Shea brushed those requests off. Another byproduct of this pandemic is that crime is on the rise, specifically gun violence. And one of the things blamed for the rising gun violence is a slowdown in response times. It's a slowdown in arrests. Now, the police commissioner refuses to say that that's part of the issue, and the public advocate here is asking for some sort of statistics in order to back that up. Despite brushing off those requests, the NYPD announced it was stepping up foot patrols during the weekends. Now, why would you do that if you did not feel that it was warranted in order for the police to be more out on the streets? Now, on the other hand, some people would say that the government of New York City brought this upon themselves. They reduced the budget of the NYPD. They made sure that the NYPD would not have overtime. There was reporting that we put out last week in our last podcast about how the police eliminated an undercover unit whose sole purpose was to try to reduce gun crime. Ironically, now that that undercover unit is gone, gun violence has since been on the rise, but it's not a causation effect. Correlation is not causation. Remember to tell your drunk uncle that next time when you're at the Thanksgiving table. The Richmond County or Staten Island DA's office released 4,000 pages related to police misconduct in the borough. Eric Gonzalez, the Brooklyn DA, promised now not to take cash contributions from police unions, joining a list of 39 other prosecutors in the U.S. New York One reported that the NYPD have been slower in responding to dispatch calls, taking an average of 12 minutes to respond versus 8 minutes from the same time last year in July. August data shows that the gap is closing. This August, it took 9 minutes versus 8 minutes last August. And de Blasio backed changes to a New York City law that banned chokeholds. All of that together is to say that currently the climate with the police in New York City is very adversarial. The mayor himself is backpedaling on having some sort of harsher stance against the NYPD. There's been reporting about this, and people can't really put their finger on why. It might be because de Blasio understands that he needs the political help from the police unions in order to help him achieve some of his campaign objectives. But at the same time, the civilians of New York City, the representatives in the city council, are reflecting the national mood when it comes to police brutality. And ever since the repeal of a statute or a law called 50A, people can now access the disciplinary records of police officers. Whereas before, you wouldn't be able to even see if a police officer has been reprimanded before to fit a pattern of violence and so on. So the city council passed a law not too long ago also banning chokeholds as a police tactic. And ever since the arrest slowdowns and the delays in response times, some city council members, last time we mentioned Donovan Richards, and the mayor are backtracking on making sure that chokeholds were banned. And now they're looking for some sort of loophole in order for the police to be able to have a tactic to break down hard assailants that they would otherwise have difficulty bringing down if a chokehold tactic was banned. Probation Officers Association President Dalvani Powell said that de Blasio needs probation officers in order to successfully institute criminal justice reform, and that laying off probation officers will hurt those efforts. Meanwhile, reform groups are pushing for the publication of corrections officers' disciplinary records, saying that the repeal of 50A applied to those officers. So it's not just cops that we're talking about. There are also corrections officers that work in our prisons that we do not currently have disciplinary records of. And this was Ms. Powell's attempt at trying to also save her corrections officers from being laid off in the midst of the city's budgetary crisis. While the mayor works on the hundreds of applications for schools to teach their students outdoors, almost 24 Bronx principals expressed concern this week in a letter to de Blasio and school chancellor Richard Carranza that they're worried about their students either being shot or picking up syringes off the ground. Instead, they prefer a continuation of either an all-online model or a hybrid model with some in-person instruction. And this week we've heard a lot of talk about, how do we make sure our schools are safe? It's a continuous discussion, and yet the date for school openings is still a hard date. The date for schools to reopen is still September 10th. That is roughly 2 weeks away now, and still there is no clear pattern as to what schools need to do in order to have safe in-person instruction. There are talks about tents being put up outside, but that question is still up in the air. 1.1 million students are relying on remote learning, but teachers are saying that they received little to no training on how to improve their remote teaching, if they're even told what subjects they're going to teach before school opens up. Teachers' unions are still reserving their right to strike, but no plans are currently set in stone. The teachers' unions are at the very least telling their union members that they refuse to enter school buildings unless they know that it is absolutely safe. The teachers' union is also demanding that masks be mandatory, but there is still no hard answer as to whether teachers will strike. De Blasio is damned if he does, damned if he doesn't here, with the mayor's plans to redivert everyone that has a teaching degree to reopen schools in the midst of the pandemic. Disability advocates worry there won't be anyone left for their students, and school principals fault the mayor and the school's chancellor for precipitating a staffing crisis. So imagine you're the mayor, you don't have any money for the city, a pandemic is raging, even though it's gotten a little bit better, but there's still a crazy chance that teachers will get sick, that kids will spread the virus, and the big question is, what do you do? City Comptroller Scott Stringer urged the mayor to rescind an executive order from March 16th that suspended the usual city contract procurement procedure. Don't stay with me here. Since then, the city has entered into $1.5 million worth of contracts to furnish ventilators, masks, and other gear for the pandemic. That's what the order from March 16th stated. Rescinding the order would allow Stringer to examine those contracts, including a recent contract we mentioned last time, between the city and Charlie Tabile, CEO of Digital Gadgets LLC, who provided the city with various personal protective equipment. The city comptroller, his job is to audit the city financially. That includes all the contracts that the city enters and make sure that taxpayers are not being taken advantage of. Here we see that Scott Stringer, who is a candidate for mayor next year, he is crossing the T's and dotting the I's on this. De Blasio received ridicule for saying he was hesitant to restart indoor dining, as it was something only for middle and upper income New Yorkers, while the rest are suffering, according to the mayor. So for those of you who are clamoring for indoor dining, you see that the numbers are starting to ease up a little bit in this pandemic, and you want to be able to eat inside again. Keep in mind that it still might not be safe, and I know that we're all clamoring for our former lives, but also keep your loved ones in mind who are already stricken with some sort of pre-existing condition. Outdoor dining has largely been a success in New York City, so keep that in mind. And if you're a business owner, a restaurant owner, this has absolutely been difficult for you, but make sure that you keep in mind that if everybody dies from a virus, there isn't really much of a restaurant for you to run. The mayor said that he's open to freezing or cutting pay instead of laying off the tens of thousands of city workers as a result of the city's budget crunch. He also said that union leaders were behind the idea, but only as a last resort. So if you're a member of the union, you work for the city, ask yourself whether you want a job at all or whether you would take a pay cut. New Yorkers protested in Times Square after the shooting of a black man, Jacob Blake, in Wisconsin. The police are saying officers responded to the scene after a call came in of a man showing up at a woman's house, and the police later cited that Blake was brandishing a knife and would not drop it despite their commands. Blake was shot 7 times in the back as he was getting in his car. His 3 children were in that car. It's not readily visible in the video that Blake was carrying a knife. The police said that they recovered it from the floor of his car. I believe that it was Blake who conceded that he did have a knife in the car. He was very transparent about that. The police shot him 7 times in the back after he refused to stop. He is now in the hospital. He is most likely paralyzed from the waist down, currently handcuffed to his leg to the hospital bed. Since that shooting, protests and riots exploded in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the cop who shot Blake is on leave. While the protest started off very peacefully, eventually as nighttime came, riots and looting started up again, and this turned into a very tragic scene because right-wing militias who take it upon themselves with a Batman mentality to come in and, quote, protect people's businesses, stand outside businesses brandishing their semi-automatic rifles, their AR-15s, and they basically stand there to intimidate. And instead of the police treating them like any other civilians, telling them to go home if there's a curfew, instead they supported what they were doing. One of those militia members is 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, who is not even from Wisconsin. His mother drove him from Illinois into Wisconsin and also gave him a semi-automatic rifle, which he thus illegally owned. And it's not clear exactly what happened, but at the end of one of those days of protests, he ended up killing 2 people. He was seen in a video running from protesters, and from what can be gathered from various news articles, and you don't have to take it from me, do your own research, there was an altercation between Rittenhouse and one of the people he killed. And I don't know what that altercation was about, but Rittenhouse ended up shooting that person in the head. And then that's when the video starts. He runs from protesters. Those protesters are seemingly trying to get Rittenhouse's gun away from him. And Rittenhouse shoots another protester in the stomach. You can see him going down in the video. And then there was another man who was also brandishing his own pistol. He was a volunteer medic who was there for the protest. Rittenhouse shot him in the arm. Now the video continues to show that Rittenhouse gets up as the protesters run away from him and walks toward police who are right there on the same block as all of this went down. And Rittenhouse walks to them with his hands up, and the police do nothing. The police do not come out of their Humvees. The police do not come out of their cars. Kyle is allowed to walk away. He actually ends up going back to his house in Illinois, and it was only after news channels aired the video that police in Illinois arrested him and have extradited him to Wisconsin. He has since been charged with at least 2 counts of murder, along with 4 other counts. Trump said that he was sending federal assistance to Wisconsin in the form of National Guard troops after speaking to the state's Democratic Governor Tony Evers. NBA teams have also, since the Blake shooting, have taken a harsher stance regarding police brutality, with the Milwaukee Bucks refusing to play at the start of Game 5 of the NBA playoffs against the Orlando Magic. Afterwards, the association delayed 2 more playoff games affecting the LA Lakers, Portland Trail Blazers, Oklahoma City Thunder, and the Houston Rockets. The MLB, the Major League Baseball organization, the Milwaukee Brewers took a cue from the NBA when they refused to come onto the pitch against the Cincinnati Reds on Wednesday. Naomi Osaka, a black tennis star, also announced she was pulling out of the Western and Southern Tennis Opens. We also saw other sports organizations, other sports teams take a stand after the Jacob Blake shooting. Eventually, the NBA teams agreed to resume the playoff games a couple of days after the boycott. And it was only after the association struck a deal with the players' union to allow some basketball arenas as election polling polling places, including Madison Square Garden here in New York City. President Trump's response to the boycott was to call the NBA a political organization and attack its ratings. A march on Washington took place this past Friday. It was scheduled to take place after Floyd's death anyway, but then ended up catching some more steam after Blake was shot. It was organized by the Reverend Al Sharpton and his National Action Network. If you're a Republican in New York, as soon as you hear the name Al Sharpton, you might be having a seizure right now. But it was also scheduled to take place on the anniversary of the Martin Luther King Jr. speech. The program allowing New Yorkers to grab free food at schools might go away once school starts up in a little over 2 weeks. If you have any difficulty during this pandemic in feeding yourself and feeding your family, make sure that you take advantage of the program before it ends. USPS documents showed that in mid-July, the service deactivated 4 out of the 48 mail sorting machines that cover Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, citing a reduction in mail volume due to the pandemic. Residents and postal workers are concerned about potential ballot delays over the mail. Please register to vote. Please come up with a voting plan for what you want to do either before November or during Election Day. Recycling hasn't always been a successful endeavor in New York City, and now, citing budgetary concerns, the Parks Department wants to get rid of 3 composting sites that the city owns the leases to, in Red Hook, the Lower East Side, and under the Queensboro Bridge. The city's 4 coronavirus testing sites might have interpreters in short supply for non-native speaking families. The Independent Budget Office projects that around 40% of New York City's families with children in public schools speak a different language other than English. Make sure you keep that in mind if you plan on getting yourself tested at one of these sites. The Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce took a survey of small businesses, and it looks like along with a second wave comes another wave of business closures. 50% of the 234 stores that were cited in the survey say they lost revenue, and 53% say they'll struggle to stay open over the next 3 months. Ladies and gentlemen, support your local mom and pop shops. Go to your delis, go to your 99-cent stores. Everybody needs a little bit of help to stay open in this pandemic. De Blasio gave the electric moped company Revel the green light to resume operations after the company hit pause on their moped rental business due to a spate of injuries and deaths. Revel agreed to new safety measures.
But I still want to make sure that we get this right.
Moving on to the city council, that clip was from Council Speaker Corey Johnson. If you've never heard him speak before, there you go. You have been exposed to his voice. He is also a candidate for mayor next year, and we'll talk about him in a second. Schools aren't the only institutions that might find themselves outdoors. Councilman Jimmy Van Bramer wants to allow cultural institutions like theaters to be able to perform out in the streets. For those of you who sat for performances like Shakespeare in the Park, this is not new to you, but there are certain things that are preventing our cultural institutions from being able to be outside. So this seems like a common sense measure for places like museums and theaters to stay alive. Council Speaker Corey Johnson showed support for allowing New York City to borrow more money through a non-binding resolution in a council vote on Thursday. Cuomo and the New York State Legislature would have to approve increasing New York's borrowing capacity. The mayor warned that without any sort of aid for the city, 22,000 workers would have to be laid off. The Municipal Labor Committee, it's a group comprised of multiple labor unions, asked de Blasio to hold off on firing anyone until they try harder to get Albany to pass a bill allowing the city to borrow money to stave off economic ruin. For those of you who aren't very familiar with the city's history, Mayor John Lindsay in the 70s had overseen a very similar budget crisis, and the city had to borrow money in order to stay alive. We might be seeing a situation like that now, that because of the coronavirus pandemic, because of the quarantines, the business closures, the loss in tax revenue, the city is standing on barely one leg. Council Speaker Johnson also seems to be pushing for a bill sponsored by Environmental Chair Costa Constantinides that would prefer the use of natural gas fuel cells over other environmental technology to reduce the amount of emissions from New York City buildings. Environmentalists say that switching to the fuel cell technology is pitching the problem as the solution. Councilman Mark Levine, who represents part of Northern Manhattan, is pushing for a bill to create a memorial for frontline workers who lost their lives due to the coronavirus, to step forward from banging on your pots at 7 p.m. every night. City Councilman Mark Traeger, who leads the Education Committee and represents part of South Brooklyn, lambasted the Department of Education for using a stick and toilet paper to inspect ventilation systems in classrooms. There's video of this online. You can go ahead and check it out. Traeger also called for Cuomo to delay the start of in-person instruction in schools because of safety concerns. City Councilman Richie Torres has introduced a series of bills that would establish a cybersecurity unit inside the city's Department of Investigations. The series of bills also seeks to codify the department's responsibility to fight against cyber attacks in the city's governing document, the City Charter.
You're not going to provide federal funds?
Moving on to Governor Cuomo, that clip was from one of Cuomo's recent coronavirus briefings. The city is not the only ones looking for some sort of aid. The state, through Andrew Cuomo, he is trying to get federal aid in order to help stave off economic catastrophe. 100 inmates over the age of 60 were transferred to Adirondack Correctional Facility because of the pandemic, but it turns out that the conditions at the facility itself might be threatening to kill them as well. The MTA is adding almost 800 jobs while threatening to fire others and raise fares in the midst of this budget crisis. MTA Chairman Pat Foy said that firing workers would be the last resort, but that the agency would need $12 billion to prevent steep cuts. We reported last time that if the MTA does not get the money it needs to stay afloat, you might see a reduction in response times to the trains. You might have a harder time getting to work. You might see less express trains running. The agency is also seeking to cut the Long Island Railroad service in half by closing 1 or 2 branches, and that could spell disaster for out-of-city workers who come in from the suburbs like Long Island. Cuomo said this week that New York State has the lowest infection rate since the beginning of the pandemic and instituted testing sites at JFK and LaGuardia airports. A delegation of New York Republicans went to the Republican National Convention this week, attacking Cuomo for his coronavirus policies and calling them a terrible shame. There are questions regarding a $55 million 5-year contract that New York canceled with a nonprofit that employed people with disabilities for printing services. The state still has almost $1 billion in contracts with other vendors that fulfill the same services, but the contract that was just canceled was one of the unique ones that deals with employing disabled individuals. Cuomo signed 5 executive orders related to the upcoming general election in November. The Board of Elections is to send letters to voters explaining how to request ballots and informing voters of deadlines, making it clear where to sign ballots, required full staffing at boards, and begins counting absentee ballots 2 days after the polls close, allowing voters to cite coronavirus as the reason to vote absentee in villages and towns. Some state legislators think that these executive orders aren't enough, with State Senator Brad Hoylman, we mentioned last time that he's running for Manhattan Borough President, introducing a bill himself that would establish special postal drop boxes for people to drop off their ballots if they're too afraid of standing in line at the polls. Some low-risk school sports might be coming back. Cuomo outlined when tennis, soccer, field hockey, cross-country track, and swimming can return as early as September 21st. Football, wrestling, and ice hockey are limited to practice only starting on October 19th. New York is sending a team of 10 firefighters to help California in its fights against the state's wildfires. Wildfires are currently ravaging California, along with Colorado and Wyoming. Environmentalists are fearing that because of climate change, the wildfire season is starting earlier than usual. Already, California is seeing record-breaking wildfires. After President Trump's executive order allowing some FEMA money to be used for extending unemployment assistance, New York was finally approved for the $300 a week benefit after the state was told it would not have to pitch into the funding pool. We reported last time that President Trump passed some executive orders, and one of those orders involved using a fund from FEMA to pay people $300 a week in unemployment money. Originally, states were expected to pitch in at least $100 per unemployment claim, but because states have no money at all to pay with, the federal government decided to drop that requirement. While Cuomo's administration continues to be under the microscope for its nursing home policies, there are also pediatric nursing homes that still have rules in place that prevent the children in those homes from seeing their loved ones for 5 months and counting. The New York State Bar Association and the Department of Justice opened investigations into Cuomo's nursing home policies, which are being used to argue that the administration sent seniors to their deaths because they were kept in nursing homes instead of hospitals after being diagnosed with COVID. And Cuomo announced that colleges that see a spike in coronavirus cases have to move to an entirely remote system for 2 weeks. Moving on to the state legislature. If you owe taxes on a property, you might not be able to stave off a tax sale coming up soon. The state legislature might come to the rescue, however. State Senator Leroy Comrie and Assemblyman David Weprin have introduced a bill aiming at stopping Mayor de Blasio from sending tax-delinquent property owners to collections by delaying lien sales for a year. A sale scheduled for September 4th would have involved 9,500 residential and commercial properties. Data from 2017 shows almost $800 million in outstanding fees from properties. New York City plans on moving forward with a tax lien auction, expecting $57 million in revenue. So, which side would you possibly be on? The side saying that the city needs money and possibly gaining $57 million, or property owners that have been delinquent on their taxes due to various reasons and possibly losing their property. Keeping the trend of state officials running for New York City local offices, Assemblywoman Nathalie Fernandez is running for Bronx Borough President. Other candidates include City Council members Cabrera and Gibson. Borough presidents advise and lobby the mayor and help fill community board seats in their boroughs. So if you're not aware, the organization of political offices in our city boroughs starts with community boards. One might argue that, of course, it's PTAs, but community boards are usually one of the most local political offices that someone can be appointed to, and they're involved with very minute neighborhood dealings. State senators turn to Congress for help in filling the state budget gap concerning education funding. Without a solution, schools face a budget cut of 20% across the board, so that only compounds the worries. Former State Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver finally reported to prison this week after numerous court battles played out from indictment to conviction to sentencing. Silver was one of the state's most powerful Democratic leaders before a public corruption investigation revealed that Silver was receiving money from real estate developers through a law firm Silver was still working at, and in exchange for favorable tax reductions, which after various rehearings landed Silver in prison for 6.5 years and a $1 million fine. State lawmakers are asking the state liquor authority to ease up on fines they call exorbitant against bars and restaurants accused of violating COVID regulations. A group of restaurant owners protested in Brooklyn this week to push New York City to adopt indoor dining regulations, as we mentioned earlier. Currently, restaurants can only offer outdoor dining.
Please rise. Court is now in session.
Moving on to the state courts. Protesters who were arrested, detained, and injured during the citywide curfew earlier during this pandemic are now planning to sue the city and the NYPD. State Attorney General Letitia James sued the Trump Organization in an attempt to force Eric Trump to be deposed. Eric Trump originally agreed to be interviewed by the Attorney General, but then refused to cooperate. The Manhattan District Attorney is also investigating the Trump Organization for financial fraud. The State Attorney General also sued the Trump administration along with New Jersey over the slowdown of mail by the United States Postal Service. The USPS's policy changes of getting rid of overtime, banning extra mail trips, and removing sorting machines and collection boxes threatens the timely transport of mail-in ballots, the Attorney General said. State Republicans have failed in their attempt at getting a Republican on the ballot to challenge Democratic State Senator John Brooks after the New York Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, declined to hear the Republicans' lawsuit. Last December, a 60-year-old woman walking on a Midtown street was killed by a piece of falling debris from a building under repairs. Her husband finally filed suit on Monday against New York City and the building's owners, claiming negligence and $10 million. New York's Chief Justice Janet DeFiore announced that some physical jury trials will be moving forward on a pilot basis. So far, there have been a few virtual jury trials that have commenced for non-complicated cases, but the courts are taking it slow during the pandemic. Nassau and Suffolk County of Long Island are seeing a lot of uncontested judicial races as both parties, Democrat and Republican, cross-endorsed candidates. Judicial races are known to have these cross-endorsements, and not just from the Democrat or Republican Party. There are also conservative party lines, working family party lines, and sometimes parties are created out of thin air. And that's in accordance with New York State election law. It's legal as a way to keep judicial races as nonpartisan as possible. Brooklyn Family Court Judge Alan Beckoff ordered that the court does not have the power to remove a 15-year-old's DNA from the NYPD's database. Judge Beckoff also said that he didn't have the power to stop the NYPD from uploading the 15-year-old child's DNA to the NYPD database that is used in investigations. The database is run by the City Medical Examiner, which holds 80,000 samples and 32,000 suspected profiles. A group of Upper West Siders is taking the mayor of New York City to court over his homelessness policies. And if the mayor does move homeless people back into the shelter, the Legal Aid Society will promise to sue. We reported last time that de Blasio, as a result of the pandemic raging through the homeless shelter system, moved homeless individuals into hotels as temporary shelters in order to protect them. Upper West Siders don't like that, and so they have been complaining nonstop of homeless people doing lewd things out in public, including urination, masturbation, public drunkenness. De Blasio promised to move homeless people back into the shelter system, never gave a timeline, and now Upper West Siders are suing. But as we just mentioned, the mayor might be seeing another lawsuit from the Legal Aid Society. People who received summonses during the pandemic will now have to show up starting September 8th. Bench trials are resuming that same day in Manhattan and Queens Housing Court, and Bronx Housing Court bench trials are starting September 15th. Ghislaine Maxwell's defense team were the first group of people granted in-person access to a federal prison since the start of the pandemic. Maxwell is currently held without bond on sex trafficking charges, stemming from her allegedly funneling children to have sex with wealthy socialite Jeffrey Epstein and his friends. Epstein killed himself while awaiting trial in the Metropolitan Correctional Facility, some saying under dubious circumstances. The Office of Court Administration intends to resume eviction proceedings after multiple extensions, telling Cuomo and state lawmakers to legislatively extend a moratorium this time.
Leaders and fighters for freedom and liberty and the American dream, the best is yet to come.
That clip was from the Republican National Convention at the end of day one. Kimberly Guilfoyle, that's Don Jr.'s girlfriend, gave that speech. More on the Republican National Convention. Trump and Mike Pence were formally nominated as candidates for president and vice president on the first day of the convention. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a speech from Jerusalem violating the State Department's own policies on government employees participating in political campaigning. Trump planned on giving a speech every day, and he certainly made appearances every day. The Republican National Convention tried to cast Biden as the actual divisive dark candidate and Trump as the empathetic uniter. But the convention quickly turned dark in various aspects by promising that if Biden was elected, then basically every city in America would turn into a pile of rubble. Highlights from the first day were speeches by Nikki Haley, Trump's former ambassador to the UN, and Tim Scott, the only black Republican in the Senate. Day 2 saw Tiffany Trump and Melania giving the keynote speeches for the night, and Melania specifically was seeking to overcome her 2016 mishap when, at the time, she faced charges of plagiarizing from Michelle Obama's past speeches. Melania spoke of sympathizing with those who have lost loved ones due to the COVID pandemic, or who are sick with the virus right now. The administration is coming under fire for using government property and presidential powers for political purposes. We saw on day 2, the president used the convention to pardon someone called John Ponder. He was a convicted bank robber who cooperated with the FBI and turned his life around. And then Trump held a naturalization ceremony televised to convention viewers. And reportedly, at least one of the participants didn't even know they were going to be in the Republican National Convention. They were there to become a citizen. Additionally, New York City Housing Authority tenants gave an interview to Lynn Patton, Trump's official who oversees federal housing programs. They also say that they were tricked into appearing at the convention without their consent. Vice President Pence headlined Day 3, taking a stand against riots and looting in Wisconsin and professing support to law enforcement. He asked people to make America great again, again. The final day of the convention finally saw Trump accepting the Republican presidential nomination, and he teared into Biden. 1,500 people had gathered on the south lawn of the White House with barely any social distancing and barely any masks worn. 4 individuals who attended the president's speech were diagnosed with COVID after. Biden and Harris held their counter-programming on the last day of the convention, saying that Trump was gaslighting Americans and that the president was rooting for more violence for his own political gain. Fact-checkers have especially decried Trump's speech as perpetuating the same lies and falsehoods that the president told since the beginning of his term almost 4 years ago. CNN's own Daniel Dale went a little viral because he continued to outline what exactly the president was lying about.
Daniel, certainly there's a lot to break down from the president's more than hour-long speech. Anderson, this president is a serial liar, and he serially lied tonight. I counted preliminarily more than 20 false or misleading claims. I want to go through a whole bunch of them quickly because I think it's all important. Trump said Joe Biden is, quote, talking about taking down the border wall. Biden has specifically, explicitly rejected that idea. He just said he'll stop further additional construction. Trump claimed, as always, that he is the one who passed the Veterans' Choice Law. Barack Obama signed that into law in 2014. Trump signed a 2018 law to modify it. Trump said, I have done more for the African-American community than any president since Abraham Lincoln. That is ludicrous. Lyndon Johnson, for one, signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Trump again touted a, quote, record 9 million job gain over the past 3 months. He didn't mention, as usual, that that gain follows a record 22 million job loss over the previous 2 months. He said he'll, quote, continue to lower drug prices. They've increased during his presidency. He said they opened a Jerusalem embassy for less than $500,000. Early documents show it was at least 21 million. He claimed NATO member spending has increased for the first time in about 20 years. Spending, in fact, rose in 2015 and in 2016 before he took office. He said he will always, and Republicans will always, strongly protect people with pre-existing conditions. That pledge has already been broken. He and they have repeatedly tried to weaken those protections in Obamacare. He claimed again that he banned travel from China and Europe. No, he imposed partial restrictions with many exemptions. Tens of thousands of people continue traveling over. He boasted about the COVID testing system and about his general response. Look, experts near universally say the U.S. was fatally slow in its response, especially slow in setting up adequate testing. He said that he ended what he called a NAFTA nightmare, and he signed a brand new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA. That agreement preserves, maintains most of NAFTA. He boasted about building about 300 miles of border wall. What he didn't say is that most of that is a replacement barrier. As of August 7th, according to official data, just 5 miles had been built where none existed before. He suggested that Joe Biden would confiscate guns. That's baseless. Biden is running on a non-mandatory buyback of so-called assault weapons. He said Democrats want to defund the police. Biden, again, doesn't, has rejected that. He said he has, quote, very good information that China wants Biden to win because Biden is soft on China or cheerleads for China. The U.S. intelligence community says China wants Biden to win because it sees Trump as unpredictable. He said Biden vowed to close down charter schools. Biden's plan is skeptical on charters, but would not abolish them entirely. He denounced Biden for voting for the Iraq War. Biden did indeed vote for the Iraq War, but what Trump doesn't mention is that he also supported that invasion. He said Democrats twice removed the word God from the Pledge of Allegiance at their convention. 2 individual caucus meetings outside the main primetime programming did leave it out, but it was uttered in every primetime event. Trump denounced so-called cancel culture as like an insidious left-wing thing. He, Donald J. Trump, has tried to get dozens of people and entities canceled, fired, boycotted, including literally last week, Goodyear. He said he imposed an order to give 10 years in prison to rioters. That's a maximum discretionary sentence up to judges in existing laws. His order just asked the government to fully enforce. And he said that Biden's plan would eliminate America's borders. No, just no. It's wrong.
Oh, that's it? I'm just
There's
kidding.
more.
Yeah, I mean, wow.
How much time do you got, Anderson?
Daniel Dale, keep at it. Thank you.
After the convention was over, Trump began campaigning by speaking in front of crowds in New Hampshire, while Pence was sent to Minnesota and Michigan. The Food and Drug Administration authorized plasma treatment over scientists' objections. The Food and Drug Administration Commissioner Stephen M. Hahn had to correct himself later in the week, saying he overstated the efficacy of plasma treatment. So what happened was the FDA gave emergency orders allowing plasma treatment to be used as a coronavirus treatment. And plasma is something taken from blood from people who have been already sick with a virus. After they're sick, their bodies create antibodies that show that there might be some sort of immunity to the sickness that the person had. And blood plasma might be used in order to help others by injecting plasma into their bloodstream to help them fight the virus. The commissioner had originally said that plasma treatment became an absolute treatment to the virus, but later had to correct himself because that's wrong. Later on, 2 PR advisors for the FDA were fired as a result of the commissioner's own gaffe. One of the advisors was Emily Miller, who worked in communications on Ted Cruz's presidential campaign, and she was also a journalist on the recently created conservative news company One American News. The Centers for Disease Control had also changed their testing guidelines to exclude testing of people suspected of having COVID if they had been exposed to others afflicted of the virus. Two CDC officials were cited in a New York Times report as saying that the agency was pressured by Trump administration officials to change the guidance. That guidance involved people who were asymptomatic, who were afraid that they were exposed by others that might have the virus, saying that they should get tested, and the CDC changed that to saying, don't worry about it. The FDA had also green-lighted an emergency use authorization for Abbott Laboratories, $5 rapid antigen tests, returning results in about 15 minutes. The company says that their tests are 97% accurate. The president announced the purchase of 150 million tests from the Abbott Laboratories for $750 million. Meanwhile, Moderna, one of the pharmaceutical companies that is ahead of the race to develop a COVID vaccine, failed to disclose federal support in the 126 patents they filed over the course of 10 years, according to activist researchers in a new report. One has to wonder how the people whose jobs it is to stay close to the president are dealing with the whole close transmission thing in the middle of this pandemic. The Secret Service are struggling with COVID cases as Trump insists on traveling and campaigning, stretching the agents thin as they try to abide by health guidelines. The Manhattan District Attorney agreed to delay Trump's tax return subpoenas for Mazars USA so that Trump's lawyers can argue against the legal validity of the District Attorney pursuing the documents. Trump nominates Chad Wolf as Secretary of Homeland Security in a permanent role. Wolf was acting only temporarily on an acting basis since November 2019. The last Senate-confirmed Homeland Security Secretary was Kirstjen Nielsen. Miles Taylor, Nielsen's then Chief of Staff, accused Trump of offering pardons to immigration officials if they broke the law to enforce Trump's immigration promises. Trump pardoned Alice Johnson, the woman whose sentence he commuted while she was serving time for nonviolent drug offenses, a day after his convention ended. Alice Johnson's commutation was part of the rollout of Trump's signing of the First Step Act, which reformed sentencing laws in relation to nonviolent drug offenses. TikTok is filing a challenge against Trump's executive order banning TikTok and other Chinese companies from operating in the United States. Trump cited those companies as national security threats because theoretically, if a Chinese company wanted to operate, they had to be able to also agree to sharing data with the Chinese government. That's a condition of becoming a Chinese company. While TikTok is ramping up to challenge Trump's executive order, TikTok CEO Kevin Mayer resigned. He was serving as CEO for 3 months. Walmart joined Microsoft as possible buyers of the social media app. TikTok owner ByteDance is asking for $30 billion. The U.S. this week set new restrictions on Chinese firms that have businesses linked to the South China Sea from easily acquiring U.S. visas and export licenses. The South China Sea, shared by China and other Asian countries, is heavily contested, with the Chinese building man-made naval bases to back up their claims of ownership. China responded by conducting their own military exercises, capped with firing missiles into the South China Sea. Trump's sister was caught on a hot mic this week. Recently, Trump's niece, Mary Trump, wrote a book. Trump suffers from mental and emotional abuse from gleaning from his family history. And Trump's sister, who was a judge, normally kept quiet about Trump all these 4 years, including his campaigning, but this time she was caught on a hot mic.
The president was dealt another blow this weekend, this time from his own family.
The change of stories, the lack of preparation, the lying, the holy sh**.
According to audio first obtained by the Washington Post, the president's sister, retired federal judge Marianne Trump Berry, was recorded by her niece Mary slamming her famous brother.
All he wants to do is appeal to his base. He has no principles. None. And his base, I mean, my God, if you were a religious person, you want to help people, not do this.
The president's chief of staff brushed it aside.
You know, just another day and another attack that we continue to see.
Last time we reported that Trump praised the conspiracy group QAnon, thanking them for basically supporting him. But Trump's chief of staff this week, Mark Meadows, said that Trump doesn't even know what QAnon is. 24 former GOP Congress members launched Republicans for Biden, including Jeff Flake, who was known for, near the end of his term, taking a stand against President Trump. Earlier we mentioned Secretary of State Pompeo speaking from Jerusalem during the Republican National Convention. He started a Middle East tour at that moment. At first he started in Israel, and then he went to Sudan, the first Secretary of State since Condoleezza Rice to visit that country. Pompeo pushed Sudan to normalize ties with Israel, He asked Sudanese leader Omar al-Bashir. Sudan's prime minister, however, rebuffed resuming ties with Israel, saying that the transitional government there, currently in Sudan, does not have a mandate to do so. 4 U.S. troops were injured with concussion-like symptoms after a skirmish with Russian soldiers in Syria. The Syrian civil war started in 2011, with Russia eventually stepping in to protect its interests by backing Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The rebels were virtually wiped out, and the war essentially became an afterthought after the rise and even the fall of ISIS. U.S. and Russian forces are still in the area to fight off their own definitions of terrorists. In a country not too far away, in Iraq, the Pentagon announced it is cutting the U.S.-Iraqi forces to 3,500 troops. That's a reduction of a third. Hurricane Laura hit the Gulf Coast as a Category 2 storm on Wednesday and Thursday. Hundreds of thousands were ordered to flee. 20-foot storm surges were predicted in Texas and Louisiana, and Laura had temporarily upgraded to a Category 4 on Tuesday. The hurricane hit the Gulf on Thursday and caused substantial damage to towns and coastal areas. Trump announced on Thursday that he would visit Louisiana in the areas that Hurricane Laura ravaged on the weekend. Thankfully, the hurricane did not cause as much damage as was predicted. The Treasury Department is under fire for not using $259 billion that Congress gave it to use for loans for businesses and state and local governments under financial distress, and that's from a total pool of $454 billion. Meanwhile, Treasury is starting to implement Trump's payroll tax deferral order, postponing some payroll taxes that would have been due between September 1st and December 31st, and instead pushes the due date to between January 1st and April 30th. Last time we reported that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce claimed 30 industry groups were not likely to implement the payroll tax holiday. The payroll tax deferment might affect the pool of funds feeding into Social Security, and with Trump's promise to forgive those taxes if he's reelected, it's not clear where the money will come from to pay the Social Security fund. The National Department of Labor reported that there are 1 million less unemployment claims in the latest economic report, but the country is far from being out of the woods. There were still 608,000 workers who sought federal assistance. 27 million people are unemployed currently. The Federal Reserve, the country's central bank, is set to freeze their interest rates until inflation forces its hands, the theory being that this will help increase employment numbers. The Department of Justice seized 280 cryptocurrency accounts tied to North Korea's hacks on crypto wallets. Cryptocurrency is digital, non-tangible currency held in accounts. The DOJ also warned banks of North Korean hacks. North Korea has a history of hacking into the U.S., including U.S. moving companies such as Sony in 2014.
Just don't tell anybody I told you this. Especially don't tell Joe Biden. I don't think that there should be any debates.
That recording was from Nancy Pelosi, who at a press conference basically said that she encourages Joe Biden not to debate Trump because Trump is just basically going to lie his way through the entire ordeal. The House on Saturday, remember last time we talked about how the House was going to pass a $25 billion USPS aid package. And at the time of the recording last time, it wasn't done yet, but they voted it through. The Senate is not likely to take that up. And the USPS and the person in charge of the USPS, Louis DeJoy, was deposed at a House hearing. And nothing really changed. Louis DeJoy, again, promised to hold off on the reforms he was seeking for the USPS until after the election. Representative Joaquin Castro said he is investigating Secretary of State Pompeo's speech to the Republican National Convention from Israel as a violation of the Hatch Act, a law that prevents government employees from using their official positions for political reasons. Trump and Pence are immune from the Hatch Act. Department of Homeland Security Acting Secretary Chad Wolf also appeared at the RNC, and yet it was DHS employees who received warnings over email not to mix campaigning and government work. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel of New York started contempt proceedings against Mike Pompeo after the Secretary of State refused to provide documents to the committee that it subpoenaed in relation to Trump's impeachment proceedings. Representative Paul Tonko and other federal lawmakers are circulating legislation that could provide $120 billion in relief to locally owned businesses. Applicants would get aid that would cover the difference between how much money their restaurant made in 2019 and their projected revenue for the rest of the year. The bill would also provide $60 million in relief to businesses owned by women, veterans, and people of color. Representative Adam Schiff, the head of the House Intelligence Committee, warned that the FBI never probed for whether Trump's foreign ties to other countries through his business dealings were ever potentially national security threats. One big component of the Mueller investigation had to do with Trump's potential hotel deal in Russia and whether Deutsche Bank was involved in funneling illicit payments to Russian oligarchs as part of a potential deal. Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, said his office reached out to Speaker Pelosi's office to continue negotiations again for a COVID relief bill, which would restore the one-time $1,200 a person payout and $600 a week unemployment insurance assistance. It's not clear what Meadows has considered in response to Pelosi and Schumer's offer to cut $1 trillion from the Democrats' proposal. Data shows that Americans have been spending less on groceries ever since the federal unemployment money dried up, and that's not a good factor to place in the equation when it comes to the economic pain the country is going through. One of New York's House Congresswomen AOC, that's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Nydia Velázquez, introduced a bill that would allow Puerto Ricans to vote for their delegates in a territorial convention. Congressman Jose Serrano, another New Yorker, decried the measure as a way to get Puerto Rico's elite to make big decisions for the entire territory. Puerto Rico isn't a state, although its inhabitants are considered U.S. citizens. They have a non-voting delegate in Congress. In the Senate, Senator Warner says Americans need more information to stop Russian disinformation campaigns in the 2020 election. Recently, a report was released by the Senate Intelligence Committee basically outlining how Russia favored Trump in the 2016 election, and Trump's own campaign officials were basically rooting for that result to happen and didn't stop it. Senator Warner is trying to say that there isn't enough information out there on what the Russians are doing ahead of the 2020 elections. Senator Elizabeth Warren is seeking more information on the contract between Trump and Operation Warp Speed co-chief Moncef Slaoui, who has been allowed to keep personal investments and not make ethical disclosures related to his holdings in pharmaceutical companies and hedge funds such as GlaxoSmithKline and Medici. Senator Elizabeth Warren, as some may recall, ran for president in the Democratic primary, and Operation Warp Speed is the effort to create a coronavirus vaccine in record time.
Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay.
What you just heard was the call before the Supreme Court always goes into session. Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. That comes from medieval English and French. It means to hear, and it's still used to this day. 4 U.S. cities in New York, California, Illinois, and South Carolina are suing the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives in the Southern District of New York for their failure to regulate sales of guns put together by various parts that make them untraceable, called ghost guns. The 4 cities are alleging that the regulations put forth by the ATF and the Department of Justice's interpretation of federal statute have allowed for ghost guns to run rampant and kill people. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals voted in a 2-1 decision to lift an earlier preliminary injunction placed against federal officers in Portland from forcing journalists and legal observers from areas the officers declare an unlawful assembly, saying the right for reporters and lawyers to be left on the scene is, quote, without legal basis. 74 individuals face federal charges in connection to the Portland protests. Protests in Portland, Oregon started after the death of George Floyd, the black man who died at the hands of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Portland became the scene of federal officers dressed in green uniform without any identifying insignia, rounding up protesters without due process. And in other news that doesn't quite fit into our structural model, I wanted to mention that in coronavirus news, big companies such as Amazon, Cargill, McDonald's, Target, Smithfield Foods, Urban Outfitters, GE, and Delta Airlines allegedly placed gag rules on their employees from being able to report coronavirus cases in the workplace. Currently, the United States registers almost 6 million coronavirus cases and almost 182,000 deaths. And finally, Jerry Falwell Jr. resigned as Chancellor of Liberty University after a picture came out showing him shirtless with his arms around another woman. There's been a lot of scandal involved with the former Liberty University Chancellor. Liberty University is a religious college that is known for its draconian rules, such as involving students taking an honor code not to have sex before marriage. Trump and Jerry Falwell Jr. have a close relationship. Trump used Jerry Falwell to have Falwell deliver evangelical voters to him in the 2016 election. In the beginning, Jerry Falwell said that he was going to step down as chancellor from Liberty University and then refused to resign, but then eventually came around and stepped down. And that's our show for August 23rd to the 29th. Again, big shout out to Sila Flow for producing our opening theme. I also want to take a second to thank May Vutrapong-Vatana for designing our logo. As always, I would appreciate if you shared, reviewed, and rated this podcast. We absolutely depend on your support in order to keep this podcast going and keep the dream alive for the 25th hour. Visit us on Patreon and become a patron today for as low as $7 a month, which gives potential benefits such as exclusive episodes and being able to request certain episodes to be recorded, as well as shout-outs on our podcast. Please join us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Again, this is Dennis Futoryan, and we'll see you next week.